AITA for moving my $3.8 million banking relationship after my wife's relatives mocked my education. I'm Benjamin, 43, and Lauren and I had been married for 9 years when this happened. I never went to college. This has never been a secret, and for most of my adult life, I didn't think of it as some dramatic missing piece. At 18, my family needed me working, not sitting in a classroom. My dad had serious health problems, bills still showed up every month, and the choice in front of me was pretty simple. I went to work. I always figured I might go back later. Later turned into a few years, then a decade, then a life that had already gone in another direction. My dad owned a few small rental properties, nothing glamorous. I started helping with whatever needed doing. At first, that meant collecting rent, meeting repair guys, cleaning out units after tenants left, and driving across town because somebody said a water heater was making a noise. Over time, I learned the parts nobody puts in a motivational speech. I learned what a bad estimate costs when the job is already half finished. I learned that a property that looks profitable on paper can eat cash for 6 months. I learned taxes by paying people who knew more than I did and asking enough questions that eventually I understood what I was looking at. I learned contracts by signing a few I wished I'd read more carefully. I learned not to confuse gross rent with income, not to treat maintenance as a surprise, and not to believe somebody just because they wore nicer shoes than I did. When my dad died, I kept managing what was left. I bought and sold a few small properties over the years, rolled money forward, made mistakes, got lucky sometimes, and got better at spotting the difference between the two. I didn't become rich overnight. There wasn't a lottery ticket, a secret inheritance, or a company sale nobody knew about. It was just more than 20 years of property, work, reinvestment, and eventually selling things that had appreciated. Lauren knew all of that before she married me. Actually, one of the things I loved about her early on was that she never treated college like the question I had failed to answer correctly. A lot of people hear high school diploma from a grown man and immediately ask some version of, "So why didn't you go back?" Lauren didn't. When I told her the reason, she said, "You did what your family needed. I don't know why anybody would turn that into something embarrassing." A few years later, when we were already serious, she told me she liked that I never seemed to need a title to feel important. That stuck with me. Her family was different. They weren't monsters. That's important because I know how these stories can sound once you line up all the worst moments. Most of the time, they were polite. They hosted good dinners. They remembered birthdays. They asked about work, vacations, home repairs, whatever normal families talk about. But education and professional status were woven into almost everything. Lauren's grandfather, Malcolm, was 81 and had been president of the family bank for a long time. He had the kind of presence where people sat a little straighter when he spoke, even at home. He didn't brag loudly. He didn't need to. His version of status was quieter than that. He remembered what school everybody attended, where their children were applying, which cousin had made partner, and which grandchild was still finding direction. Lauren's mother, Sylvia, was similar in a softer way. She liked the word discipline. A degree showed discipline. A prestigious job showed discipline. A professional title showed discipline. She once told me, in what I think she intended as a compliment, that I was surprisingly organized for someone who learned everything informally. Lauren's uncle Warren, Sylvia's brother, was 57 and worked at the bank managing high-net-worth client relationships. He was smart. I won't pretend otherwise. He knew his business, he was good with people, and when he was actually doing his job, he could explain complicated options clearly without making a client feel stupid. He also had a way of treating the credentials around a person like part of the person's net worth. The jokes about me started small enough that I ignored them. At one Thanksgiving, somebody was talking about graduate programs, and Warren asked if I was the family's control group. At another dinner, Malcolm asked whether I ever wished I'd gone back for the formal part of my education. Once, Sylvia compared me to the husband of one of Lauren's cousins and said, "Of course, James had the benefit of business school, so he sees things a little differently." Lauren would squeeze my knee under the table or roll her eyes afterward. "They're just teasing," she'd say. Or, "You know how they are." Or, "Don't make it a thing." And for a long time, I didn't. Partly because I genuinely didn't care what Malcolm thought of my transcript, but partly because I cared more than I wanted to admit. I had spent enough years around people who assumed I was insecure about not going to college that I became weirdly determined to prove I wasn't. So when somebody made a comment, I swallowed it. I told myself the confident response was not reacting. I didn't understand at the time that staying quiet doesn't always make something disappear. Sometimes it just teaches people the boundary isn't real. About a year before the dinner that started all of this, I sold the last commercial property I still owned from the group of assets my dad and I had built up over the years. After the sale, taxes, obligations, and money I had already earmarked elsewhere, I had roughly $3.8 million that I wasn't ready to lock into a long-term strategy yet. It wasn't sitting in one checking account like a cartoon pile of cash. It was spread across cash management, savings, and short-term products while I reviewed what I wanted to do next. I had records for the sale proceeds and the source of the funds because moving money at that level involves more paperwork than people imagine. I had already spoken with a couple of institutions when Lauren suggested her family's bank. I immediately said no. Why? She asked. Because I don't want to mix family and money. She laughed a little and said, "It's still a bank, Ben. You're not handing Uncle Warren a suitcase." She said Warren could get me good service, competitive fees, and a direct point of contact. She also said it would be a nice way to support her family without actually costing us anything. I still wasn't comfortable. I remember texting her later that week because I wanted to make sure I wasn't walking into some invisible obligation. I wrote, "If I move it there, this doesn't become some family loyalty thing, right? If I want to move it later, I move it." She replied, "No, it's your money. There are no family strings." I kept that text mostly by accident. At the time, it didn't feel important enough to save on purpose. I agreed. Warren handled the onboarding professionally. He sent me information about fees, rates, account structure, cash management options, and short-term products. I asked questions. He answered them. There was nothing in writing saying I had to keep the full relationship there for any special period beyond the normal terms on individual products. For the first couple of months, I was actually pretty happy with the bank. The weird part was how the family talked about it outside the bank. At a dinner not long after the transfer, Warren raised his glass toward Lauren and said, "I should thank you for bringing Ben over." Not me, Lauren. I noticed it, but I also thought I was being petty for noticing it. Lauren laughed and said, "You owe me one after this." Everybody moved on. A few weeks later, Malcolm asked me, "Warren keeping you out of trouble with that money?" I said, "I make my own decisions." He gave a short laugh like I'd made a joke and said, "Of course you do." Again, I let it go. There were other little things. Warren would say our client relationship while looking at Lauren instead of me. Sylvia once told relatives that Lauren was smart to get Ben connected with Warren. Lauren described me more than once as being good at the practical side, while she handled the structured side. I didn't really understand what she meant by that because she wasn't managing my investments, but I assumed she meant household planning or dealing with professionals. Then, a couple of months before the dinner, I found a better rate elsewhere for part of the money. I mentioned casually to Lauren that I might move some of the cash. Her reaction was much stronger than I expected. "Can you just leave it alone through the end of the year?" I looked at her. "Why does the end of the year matter?" "It's cleaner," she said. "Less paperwork." That answer didn't make much sense. Moving it in January wasn't magically going to eliminate paperwork. I said that. She got annoyed and said, "I'm not saying you can't move it. I'm saying every time you see a slightly better number somewhere, you don't have to shuffle things around." That wasn't a fair description of how I handled money, and she knew it. But I didn't push. In hindsight, that should have been the moment I asked a second question. I didn't. Then came the dinner. It was a family dinner after an event connected to the bank. Nothing formal enough for tuxedos, but more polished than a normal Sunday meal. Warren had been in a very good mood all evening. Malcolm had been telling stories about people he'd worked with over the years. Education came up because one of the younger relatives was deciding between schools. Before we even went in, Lauren had said to me, "Please don't get into money with Uncle Warren tonight." I thought that was odd. Was I planning to? No, I just mean don't let him drag you into one of his debates. I shrugged it off. At dinner, Warren asked the younger relative what she wanted to study. Somebody said finance. Warren said that was smart because you should know enough to understand the people managing your money. Then he looked at me. You ever think about getting some formal education so you actually know what your advisors are doing? I said, I seem to manage. He smiled. Does the high school diploma come with a calculator, at least? A few people laughed. I didn't. Malcolm took a sip of his drink and added, serious money usually comes with serious credentials. That got another laugh. Not a huge one. Nobody was pounding the table. It was the kind of family laugh people use when they know exactly who the joke is about, but don't want to admit the joke is cruel. I looked at Lauren. She gave this tiny, uncomfortable laugh, then said, Guys, come on. He knows you're kidding. That was the moment for me. Not Warren's calculator line. Not even Malcolm's comment. It was Lauren telling the room that I knew I was supposed to accept it. I put my fork down and said, That's fine. I'll move my accounts out of the bank. Warren laughed again because he thought I was continuing the joke. Sure you will. I will. Every dollar. Malcolm stopped smiling. Don't make business decisions over dinner jokes. I said, I'm not making it over a joke. I'm making it because apparently keeping my money there bought you the right to talk down to me. Warren leaned back. You're going to move millions over this? Yes. That was when I looked at Lauren again. She wasn't laughing now. On the drive home, she was furious. Not yelling, exactly. Lauren gets very controlled when she's angry, which somehow makes it sharper. You embarrassed everyone. I said, interesting choice of victim. Don't do that. You made a family dinner about money. Your uncle made a client relationship about my education. It was a stupid joke. Why didn't you tell them to stop? I did. You told me they were kidding. That's not the same thing. She stared out the windshield for a while and then said, Because I thought you could handle a stupid joke. I remember gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. You keep saying that like the problem is how well I absorb it. She said I was being dramatic. I didn't answer. The next morning, I contacted another bank I had already looked at before I moved the money to Warren's bank. I didn't storm into a branch. I didn't demand that anyone hand me $3.8 million in cash. I told them I wanted to establish the relationship we had discussed earlier and asked what they needed to begin receiving the assets. Then I contacted Warren's bank and initiated the transfer process for the liquid portion. Large transfers are boring, which is one reason I trusted myself to do it while angry. There are identity checks, forms, callbacks, source of funds records, account verification, and delays. You have time to change your mind. I didn't. Warren called that afternoon, and his tone was completely different from dinner. He was speaking as my relationship manager now. Ben, I understand you're upset. Before we process anything major, I'd like a chance to fix this professionally. Professionally would have been good last night. He ignored that. He offered to move me to another banker. He said they could review my fees. He said there were options to improve yield on part of the cash if that was my concern. I told him none of that was my concern. You're turning a family slight into a financial decision, he said. You were comfortable turning a financial relationship into a family privilege. He sighed. You don't have to like me. The bank is bigger than me. Malcolm is the president of the bank, Warren. He was sitting next to you. So what do you want, an apology? No, I want my money moved. He asked me to give them 30 days to retain the relationship with somebody else. I said no. This is one of the places where I know people can reasonably think I was acting out of anger more than financial sense. If the problem had only been Warren, switching relationship managers might have solved the practical issue. But the president of the bank had joined in, and my own wife had told me to absorb it. I no longer wanted my money there. Later that day, Warren sent a follow-up email summarizing the retention options. About halfway down, one sentence stopped me. Lauren had indicated you intended to keep the full relationship here through at least year-end. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. Lauren came home that evening and found me sitting at the kitchen table with my phone in front of me. I slid it toward her. What exactly did you promise him? She read the email and immediately said, I didn't promise him your money. Then why does he think you did? I told him you weren't the type to move money around all the time. That's not what he wrote. Ben, I was reassuring him. About my money. About the relationship. A relationship that's in my name. She sat down across from me. You're making this sound worse than it was. I pulled up the old text from before I had moved the money. No, it's your money. There are no family strings. I put it next to Warren's email. You knew what I was worried about. Her face changed then. Not dramatically. She just stopped trying to answer fast. I said, why the end of the year? She didn't respond right away. Then she said, Warren's being considered for a bigger management role. I waited. Part of it is his book. New relationships, retention, things like that. And my money helps him. It helped his numbers, yes. You knew that before I transferred it? She hesitated. That was enough. Lauren. Yes. I felt something in me go cold. Did he ask you to get me to move it? Not like that. What does that mean? He told me it would strengthen the book if you came over. I told him I thought you would be open to it. You were looking at banks anyway. The fees were good. The service was good. It wasn't some scam. I didn't say it was a scam. Did you tell him I'd stay through year end? She rubbed her forehead. I said he could count on it. I just looked at her. She hurried on. Because once you put money somewhere, you usually leave it alone. I wasn't signing anything. I didn't think of it as promising your money. I thought I was reassuring him. You reassured your uncle about an account you don't control without telling the person who controls it. You're my husband. I thought I knew how you would act. You also knew I had specifically asked whether there were family strings. That landed. She looked down at the table. I wish I could say that was the worst part. It wasn't. I asked her a question I hadn't really formed until then. What does your family think you do with my finances? She looked confused. What? You keep saying you handle the structured side. Malcolm acts like Warren is keeping me from doing something stupid. Sylvia says you got me connected with the right people. Warren thanks you for bringing me over. What exactly do they think you do? She got defensive again. I never told them I manage your money. That's not what I asked. I said I deal with the financial people more. Do you? She didn't answer. That silence hurt more than I expected. I said, did you let them think you and Warren taught me how to handle the money? No. Then, almost immediately, not exactly. I sat back. Lauren started crying, but not in a manipulative way. She looked embarrassed and angry at herself, and still angry at me all at once. She said, you don't understand what it's been like with them. I told her to explain it. She said her mother had been making comments about me since we started dating. That Lauren could have married anyone. That Malcolm worried she was choosing a harder life. That cousins and family friends had impressive degrees and jobs everyone could summarize in one sentence. And then there was me, a guy who worked with property and never went to college. I knew some of that already. I didn't know how much of it Lauren had been absorbing privately. I was trying to make them stop judging us, she said. By telling them what? That you were good at the practical part and I handled the structured side. That Warren helped us get more organized. That you listened to professionals. I do listen to professionals. I know. So why not just say that? Because they hear self-taught and they hear reckless. I wanted them to understand that marrying you wasn't me throwing my life away. I stared at her. She realized what she'd said and covered her mouth for a second. That's not how I see you. But it's the story you used. I was trying to translate you into something they would respect. That might have been the worst sentence of the whole conversation. I said, you didn't make me look better to them. You made me smaller until I fit. She cried harder after that. I didn't feel good about saying it. I still think it was true. The next couple of days were ugly in a quiet way. The transfer of the liquid assets continued. There was also a short-term product that wasn't fully mature yet. I could have left that portion at the bank until it matured, then moved it later with less cost. Instead, I asked for the early close figures. Between the penalty and the interest I would give up, leaving early would cost me about $6,900. Lauren saw the paperwork and said, you're paying thousands of dollars just to make a point. I said, I'm paying to get the whole relationship out. You can leave that one there for a few more months. I don't want to. Why? Because then Warren still gets to count it? I didn't answer fast enough. She gave a bitter laugh. So this is revenge. I said, part of it probably is. She looked shocked that I admitted it. I'm not going to pretend I'm above that, I said. I don't trust the bank relationship anymore, and I want out. But yes, I also want Warren to see the money leave the report he thought you could promise him. Both things are true. That's incredibly petty. Maybe. $6,900 petty. I can afford the penalty. That doesn't mean I'm proud of why I'm willing to pay it. What I did not do was touch our joint checking account or household money. Bills kept getting paid. Lauren had full access to the accounts that were actually ours together. The assets I moved were the ones under my control from the sale proceeds and related investments. I wasn't trying to scare my wife financially. I was removing my money from her family's bank. Sylvia called me 2 days later. Lauren had apparently told her enough that she knew the transfers were real. Everyone knows Warren jokes too much, she said. Then why is everyone surprised when somebody stops rewarding him for it? This isn't about rewarding him. This is about family. That's exactly what I was told it wasn't about when I moved the money there. She ignored that. You've always had a chip on your shoulder about school. I actually laughed at that because I had spent years doing almost anything to avoid proving that exact accusation. Maybe I should have had more of one. Lauren has defended you for years. Not at that dinner. She told them they were joking. That's not defending me. Sylvia got frustrated. Was humiliating her uncle really worth thousands of dollars? I said, did anyone call Warren and ask if his pride was expensive? She told me that was childish. I told her we weren't going to agree, and I ended the call before it turned into a competition over who could say something worse. A few days after that, Lauren told me she needed space. I didn't ask her not to go. She stayed somewhere else for 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were the first time I seriously considered that our marriage might not survive the situation. Not because of the money itself. The money was almost the easiest part because numbers behave predictably. The hard part was replaying 9 years and wondering how often Lauren had edited me after I left the room. I thought about every dinner where I had let a comment pass because I didn't want to make her uncomfortable. Every time she'd said, they don't mean anything by it. Every time I'd trusted her to describe me fairly to people who were already looking for reasons not to. I also had to admit something less flattering about myself. I had handed her that job. Not intentionally, but I had decided that because it was her family, she could manage the social friction. When they said something irritating, I looked at her. When they made a wrong assumption, I often let her correct it, or not correct it. I thought I was being mature by refusing to defend myself. What I was really doing was avoiding conflict until I had enough resentment to make a $6,900 point. Lauren and I barely spoke during the separation except about practical things. There were no dramatic late-night calls. No one emptied the house. No one filed anything. The transfer process kept moving. Warren called one more time as my banker and said the bank could still move me to another relationship manager, waive some fees for a period, and improve pricing on certain services. I told him no. He said, you're taking a real loss to prove a point. I know. A smart client doesn't make emotional withdrawals. I said, would you say that to a client who wasn't married to your niece? He paused. Then he said, I'm trying to keep business separate from family now. A little late. He didn't argue with that. Before the full relationship had finished moving, Malcolm asked for a conversation. Not a family dinner. A sit-down with him, Warren, Lauren, and me. Lauren wanted me to go. She said if we were going to have any chance of fixing things, she needed the facts said out loud in front of the people involved. I agreed. By then, she had moved back home only to pick up a few things, and we were still living separately. The meeting took place in a private room at the bank after normal business hours. It felt strange seeing Malcolm there in his professional role after years of only seeing him as Lauren's grandfather at dinners. He started with no small talk. I want to understand why a family dispute became the loss of a significant client relationship. Warren answered before I did. Because Ben decided a bad joke justified moving the entire relationship. I said, that's your version. It's what happened. You were insulted at dinner and started the transfer the next morning. Both of those things are true. Warren looked at Malcolm. He's paying nearly $7,000 to get out of one position early. That's not a rational response to service quality. I said, I never said the service quality was bad. Then this is emotional. Partly. That seemed to throw him off more than if I'd denied it. I continued, but if I learn that a bank relationship is being treated as family leverage, that changes how I evaluate the relationship. Warren said, nobody leveraged you. I looked at Lauren, then back at him. You thought the money was staying through year-end. What? He didn't answer me. Malcolm did. Warren looked annoyed. Lauren told me the assets were staying through year-end. Malcolm turned toward Lauren. Did you? Lauren's face went pale, but this time she didn't minimize it. Yes, I told him he could count on the relationship through the end of the year. Malcolm asked, did Benjamin agree to that? No. I said, I never agreed to it, and before I moved the money here, I specifically asked Lauren whether there would be any family obligation attached. She told me no. Warren said, I wasn't treating it as a contractual commitment. You were counting it as retained business, I said, because Lauren told me it was stable. Malcolm's voice got very flat. Lauren is not the client. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Warren said, she's his wife. Malcolm replied, is she an authorized decision-maker on the account? Not for what we're discussing. Then why did her assurance substitute for his? Warren started explaining that family relationships naturally involve context, that he wasn't betting the bank on my account, and that the $3.8 million was one client relationship among many. I believed him on that part. My money wasn't going to make or break the bank. It wasn't even going to make or break Warren's career. But it mattered enough to be part of his numbers. Warren finally said, I was counting it as a retained relationship. Malcolm nodded once. That was your judgment. Then Malcolm turned to me. You also made a judgment. An expensive one. Yes. You could have changed bankers. I could have. You could have left the term product until maturity. Yes. So you did want to make a point. Yes. I had decided before the meeting that I wasn't going to hide behind business language and pretend every part of my decision had been optimized on a spreadsheet. I said, I wanted out, and I wanted Warren to feel the loss of the relationship he thought my wife could promise. I know that cost me money. Malcolm studied me for a moment. Then he said, that does not make the money ours. Warren looked irritated. Malcolm continued, a client deposit is not family property. You can dislike why he left. That does not mean he owed us the money. It wasn't an apology to me. Not yet. It was Malcolm applying his own business rule. And honestly, that was more believable than some sudden emotional transformation. Then the conversation moved to the part one cared about more. Malcolm said, I was under the impression Lauren was the one who brought more structure to your financial affairs. I looked at her. She closed her eyes for a second. I asked, did you ever correct that? She said no. Malcolm looked between us. Lauren spoke before he could ask more. I let everyone think I handled more of it than I do. I said Warren helped us get organized. I said I handled the structured side. I should have been clearer that Ben has always made his own decisions about the property money and the sale proceeds. Warren said, nobody said he didn't make decisions. I turned to him. At dinner, you asked if I needed formal education to understand my advisors. Malcolm said serious money comes with serious credentials. Those jokes work because you think the money is more legitimate than the person who built it. Malcolm said, that is an interpretation. Then tell me yours. He didn't answer immediately. Lauren did. They thought you had money, but needed people like Warren to make it real. That was painful to hear out loud, but I appreciated that she finally said it plainly. She looked at Malcolm and Warren. And I helped create that impression because I wanted you to stop acting like I had made some reckless choice marrying him. Malcolm's expression tightened. No one said reckless. Lauren gave him a look I had rarely seen her give anyone in her family. Not in that exact word, no. Then she looked at me. I thought if they saw you as capable, but also connected to the right people, they'd stop judging me for marrying you. I know how that sounds now. I said, you made me smaller until I fit. She nodded. Yeah, I did. There wasn't a big speech after that. No one apologized in a chain. No one cried except Lauren, quietly, once. Malcolm eventually said, I should not have made the joke. It was unnecessary. That was as close as Malcolm got to warmth. Then he looked at Warren. And if you treated assurance from a relative as assurance from the client, that's a separate error. Warren said, understood. He didn't sound happy. Before we left, Warren made one last retention offer. New relationship manager, reduced fees for a period, better pricing in a couple of areas. From a purely financial perspective, it was not a bad offer. I said no. Warren looked at Malcolm like he expected him to push me. Malcolm didn't. He just said, that's his decision. The remaining transfers completed over the next few days. The money went to the new bank. I did not move it back later when emotions cooled off. I did not use the new bank as some symbol of victory. It was just a bank without relatives at the dinner table. Lauren came home after 3 weeks apart. We started counseling not long after. I won't pretend counseling fixed us in 2 sessions. Some weeks were repetitive and uncomfortable. I had to admit that I had used silence as a substitute for boundaries for years, then acted surprised when the final boundary came out like a hammer. Lauren had harder things to admit. She had to acknowledge that she didn't merely fail to defend me. She had actively managed the story of me around her family. She did it because she loved me and was ashamed of their judgment at the same time, which made it more complicated, not less damaging. One of the boundaries we set was very specific. Lauren would not discuss my balances, investments, sale proceeds, or financial decisions with her extended family unless I said it was okay. She would not promise my behavior to anyone. She would not tell Warren or Malcolm what I would probably do with money that wasn't hers to commit. I also stopped treating every family gathering like an obligation. I still went to some. I skipped others. That wasn't punishment. I just stopped pretending access to me was automatic because we were related by marriage. About 6 months later, Warren was still at the bank. He was not fired. The bank did not collapse. Nobody lost a house because I moved my money. His promotion was delayed. From what Lauren knew, losing my account wasn't the only reason. But the account had been part of his case for growth and retention, and losing it in a family conflict forced him to explain why he'd considered the relationship stable without a commitment from the actual client. Malcolm apparently told him he needed to demonstrate that he could attract and retain clients without relying on family leverage. That sounded fair to me. Malcolm remained Malcolm. He still cared about credentials. He still asked the younger relatives where they were applying to school. He didn't become my cheerleader. But he stopped making me the punchline in front of me. Sylvia still thought I had overreacted. She just said it less often because Lauren no longer helped her smooth it over. The real change happened at a dinner several months after everything blew up. It was smaller than the original one. Warren was talking about some project that had become harder than expected, and he made an offhand comment. Well, Ben always liked doing things the hard way. It wasn't as bad as the calculator joke. 6 months earlier, I probably would have ignored it. Lauren didn't laugh. She looked at him and said, "That isn't teasing. You're doing it again." Warren frowned. Doing what? Making him the joke because he does things differently than you. He started to say he hadn't meant anything by it. Lauren said, "Then you can mean something else." And that was it. No speech. No applause. Malcolm kept eating. Sylvia looked annoyed. Warren changed the subject. I kept eating too. In the car afterward, Lauren said, "I should have done that 9 years ago." I said, "Yeah, probably." That was all I had. We're still married. Trust didn't come back because she apologized once. It came back in smaller ways. She stopped volunteering my financial information. She corrected a couple of old stories with her mother about who actually made the decisions around my property and investments. When family members asked her what I was doing with the sale money, she started saying, "Ask Ben." I changed too. If somebody says something disrespectful now, I don't wait for Lauren to translate me. I answer for myself before resentment has time to turn into some grand gesture. I still think moving the money was the right decision. I also think paying $6,900 to get every last piece out immediately was partly me wanting to make sure Warren felt the consequence. I can admit that without pretending the rest of the issue was imaginary. The money is still at the new bank. I never accepted Warren's better fee offer to bring it back. I never went back to school to prove anything to Malcolm. I never started quoting my net worth at dinners. My money isn't proof that I'm smarter than any of them. It's just mine to place where I trust the people handling it. And for the first time in our marriage, Lauren is no longer trying to make me easier for her family to explain. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.